Hey guys, today I'm making a response to Jordan Cooper's video yesterday talking about the Reconquista project that I started 2 years ago. Basically, it's a mission to revive and retake America's historic mainline Protestant denominations, like the Episcopal Church and the United Methodist Church, that have largely drifted liberal, but our goal is to gradually retake them by strengthening the conservative remnants of each of them. And there are theologically conservative congregations within each of them, which you can find on this map. The link is in the description. So this is going to be the last reaction video I make for a while. I don't want my channel to become just reaction videos. If you want to see more, I'm going to have some exclusive content on my Patreon. Link is in the description. But yeah, so even though I don't exactly agree with Dr. Jordan Cooper on everything, I have the utmost respect for him. He taught me a lot about my own tradition, even though he's Lutheran and I'm Reformed, and many of his videos gave me initial inspiration for the Reconquista movement. So let's get right into it.
I've been asked a lot of times about Reconquista and what it is that I think about this entire project. And this has come into conversation a lot more recently because of the recent dialogue that happened between Gavin Ortlund and Radim Zoomer over these issues. And people ask me about this because Radim Zoomer watches my videos, and he has been for quite some time. And he's certainly taken some ideas from me in terms of definitions of Protestantism and certain things about institutionalism and those kind of issues. So people want to know exactly what my perspective on this whole thing is, because I haven't actually spoken to it all that much, at least all that directly. But it does seem that every time I speak somewhere in person, people are asking me about my opinions about this. So for whatever it's worth, I'm just going to throw out some general thoughts on this whole project. Now, I do want to say that I firmly support institutionalism. I am very much opposed to a perception of the church that the church is to be defined purely by individual congregations. This would lead to a much longer discussion about ecclesiology, which I certainly can do. And
Yeah, I think this was my main point of difference between Gavin Ortlund, because I don't think going to a liberal congregation is the same thing as going to a liberal church, because I think the church is larger than the local congregation.
that's one side of this.
With AI.
Yeah, I'm clearly redeemed boomer because I don't know how to get rid of ads yet.
The other is that when you're talking about institutions more broadly, I do believe that institutions as a whole tend to provide influence for a culture in a far broader sense than, say, individual personalities or trends. So, for example, what is taught in an Ivy League university in the United States is, in the long run, going to have more impact on where the culture goes than one celebrity who happens to be pretty outspoken and have a lot of influence for a short period of time. So personalities tend to impact culture in brief moments in significant ways, but if you're talking about something that's more generational, if you're talking about generational, multi-generational impact, that usually has to derive from institutions. So institutions are essential for culture change and stability in any culture or country.
Yeah, and the reason that inspired me to contribute to the Reconquista is because there are a lot of celebrity pastors in conservative offshoot denominations like Tim Keller and R.C. Sproul, but their influence is very, generational. Whereas these institutions are things that last. It used to be normal to go to the same church as your great-great-grandfather, but now it seems like evangelicals have to reinvent the wheel all the time. It's like they brag about how their congregations are mostly young people. Like, that's not a good thing. That means you don't build things that last.
So that's another point. So I agree with the Reconquista project on that general principle. Okay, so I agree on those two principles. The third of these is, and this is a place where I agree, is that we do tend, especially in an American context, maybe specifically just in an American context, we split way too often. We do tend to run from our problems rather than actually remaining within our own communal bonds. This is true with whether it's within families or whether it's in educational institutions or churches or whatever. We tend, when things get difficult or when we have to put in work to try to change something, we tend to just run away and start something new. There are a lot of reasons for this culturally, which would take a lot more time to discuss than I'm going to do in this particular video. But we have in our psyche this impulse to simply throw away what doesn't work, rather than try to fix what's broken. So we do this in very simple ways. We do this, say, with our clothes. So at one time, it was the case that if you ripped your clothes, you'd patch it up or you would sew it. But now, if you rip your clothes and you damage them, you throw them away and buy something else cheap. So we don't buy things that are actually worthwhile or that have any longevity that we have to take care of. Instead, we just throw away what's now no longer useful and then buy something else that is useful. Now, this maybe seems totally different than we're talking about in a church situation, but I think it's the same kind of mindset that we generally tend to have, is that we make things in order to get rid of them. We don't enter into institutions in order to be formed by them, but instead, we start organizations or institutions in order to control them and platform ourselves. This is just a reality of how the world works today. And you may say that I do the same thing because I'm here as a YouTube personality, right? And I've started my own organization or institution. I've put a lot of pieces
YouTube personalities, you can't trust those people. You can't trust any big YouTubers.
together in place there that the institutions I am involved in don't center just on me and have longevity beyond my lifetime. That's ultimately the goal and should always be the goal. But this kind of mindset does feed into how we view the church. And so when there is an issue in a local congregation, it is way too often the case that somebody just says, well, I don't like this, so I'm going to start my own church now. And then they leave and then start their own congregation. This is a major problem in the church in the United States. And this does not reflect a view of the reformers. The reformers were not trying to simply start new churches.
Thank you. Luther did not want to split off and start a new church.
And it wasn't the argument of the reformers that anytime there was false teaching in the church would just split again. It's not the view of Luther, it's not the view of Melanchthon, and it's not the view of a lot of other post-Reformation sources either. Sometime I would like to go through Johann Gerhard's volume on the church to talk about some of this more in depth, because I think there's a lot of important insight that we can draw on for that. Okay, so those are the things where I would say, yeah, I think that these are valid concerns. These are points where I would agree with the whole kind of Reconquista mindset and project. But at the same time, there are a number of concerns that I have about the project as a whole. So I'll share what some of those are. So the first of these is that I am not convinced, regarding the issue of cultural change or impact, that the mainline churches really have any significant say within our culture at all.
Now, I think that's true in some sense. I think the reason the mainlines no longer have significant say like they used to is because they've drifted theologically liberal and don't really believe in anything except what the culture already says. So I see mainline denominations like a mighty battleship that's either hijacked by pirates or just vacant, not doing anything, and evangelical churches as like smaller lifeboats that have a lot more soldiers on them. So right now, it seems that the evangelical churches have more influence, but I think the mainline churches are like these mighty battleships that have more potential influence. And the big difference is resources. And he's going to go into a lot of this because I watched this video already. But the big difference between mainline and evangelical churches is resources. Even though evangelical churches right now have a lot more activity within them, mainlines have more resources. For example, a lot more young people are interested in going to conservative reform seminaries like Westminster Seminary than liberal or mainline seminaries like Princeton Seminary. But Princeton Seminary has an endowment of $1.3 billion. Westminster Seminary has an endowment of $50 million. And as Dr. Jordan Cooper understands, institutional clout and resources are important for making this impact. So what would it look like if the main lines did get retaken? I think it would look similar to the Roman Catholic Church or the Southern Baptist Convention, because those are large institutional churches that have still stuck to their historic beliefs, and they do have quite a big influence, at least compared to like your average non-denominational evangelical church.
They just don't. And I've been in plenty of positions or places where there are people of influence, people who are going to be doing important things in the world, that are going to go to important positions, whether it's in politics or whatever it might be. And as I look at those individuals, I don't think that the majority of them are actually really impacted by their faith tradition of any kind whatsoever. Like most of them are just not, regardless of whether they actually attend a church or they don't. And I think this is especially true with those mainline churches. So the fact is that whatever mainline church pastor might say, even if you attend one of those congregations, is probably not going to have that significant of an impact or an influence on the decisions that somebody makes or the ideology that...
Right, because the mainline churches have abandoned their beliefs. I agree that right now the mainline churches don't have much of an actual impact, but I think they have a potential influence if they were to go back to the beliefs they were founded upon.
Individual has. So I think that when you look at the actual on-the-ground influence of mainline churches, it's basically non-existent. And there was a time where being a part of one of those churches, especially the Episcopal Church, so there isn't just a mainline church influence in our culture. There are some mainline churches that have had impact and some that really have not had much of an impact. So if you say, look at the Episcopal Church, and
I'm not sure which mainline churches, especially of the 7 that we have as part of the American Reconquista, have not had some major impact. For example, the Congregationalists founded Harvard and Yale, the American Baptists founded Brown, the Presbyterians founded Princeton, the Reformed Church in America has had lots of presidents. The United Methodist Church founded Duke. United Methodism has sometimes been called America's religion, and the Episcopal Church is something he admits has a lot of influence. Maybe the ELCA is something that doesn't have that much influence, but it still does in, like, the Midwest. Oh, sorry.
Past generations, it was the case that there was a connection between the Episcopal Church and those who tended to be in positions of prominence, positions of prominent influence in the culture. But that connection is not really there anymore. And yes, to some degree, I know people that are over 65 that are still part of the Episcopal Church, that joined the Episcopal Church, maybe even exclusively to have kind of connections or communal connections, because in certain communities it was expected that if you're somebody important, you're going to be part of this or that particular church. So you have that in people that are generally at retirement age right now. I don't think that mindset exists at all really in younger generations very much. So I just am not convinced that mainline churches have any significant influence whatsoever, and I'm not convinced that making the mainline churches Orthodox will suddenly make them more influential than Orthodox church bodies that do already exist. I mean, even just looking at my own context, in my experience at Cornell, looking at campus ministry and seeing what churches are influencing what people are thinking, who are going into prominent or important positions, as I look around and think about people that I've seen, the ones that are most impacted by their faith and the churches that they attend that are going to impact how it is that they view their life are those, non-mainline churches, like probably the most influential church in this community at Cornell upon students that I've seen where their kind of thought life is maybe formed by the church in a significant way is the ACNA church, which is, again, a break off from the Episcopal Church.
Let's see the ACNA church at Cornell. Bread of Life Anglican Church in Ithaca. And looks like they meet in a music school. They don't even have their own building. So I understand that the ACNA has an intellectual influence amongst Gen Z people who are already interested in Anglicanism, but they don't have the resources. Now, you might have a more Gavin Ortland mindset and think that intellectual influence matters more than resources, but I know Jordan Cooper doesn't. I know Jordan Cooper understands how important resources are, and nobody can deny that the Episcopal Church is stacked with resources.
So I posed a question.
Sorry, I keep going back to the wrong video. I'm about to play that in a second.
And even though the Episcopal Church, has more ties to campus, and they do have the campus organization here, and some people involved are also part of the Reconquista thing.
I actually didn't know that there were Episcopalian Reconquista members at Cornell, but let's look up the Episcopal Church of Cornell. Okay, Episcopal Church of Cornell. And let's see this. Okay, it's not... Is it going to show me what it looks like? Maybe I can see it this way. Episcopal Church at Cornell. Yeah, see this? This obviously looks like a much more wealthy and established institution than whatever Anglican church plant meets in a music school at Cornell. So I didn't even know there were Episcopal Reconquista members at Cornell. Now I'm finally going to play this video. So Jordan Cooper is saying that mainlines have not that much cultural influence. But several years ago, one of the videos he made that really made me think that we need the mainlines to regain their influence is a couple years ago, Jordan Cooper made this video wondering why Protestants have lost a seat at the table in cultural conversations. Just listen to 30 seconds of this.
So I posed a question on Twitter, and that question that I posed was why in all of the dialogue right now surrounding the crisis that we're facing in the West, it seems like there are very prominent voices from a variety of religious traditions, particularly Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Judaism, and then even some from Buddhism and some other faiths as well. But it seems like Protestantism as a whole is kind of ignored in a lot of these conversations.
Yeah, because Catholicism and Orthodoxy still hold on to their historic institutions. Protestantism has largely abandoned it. And I think back then, several years ago, I made a comment, this is why we need to take back the mainline Protestant churches, is the only way, frankly, for Protestantism to survive. Whether we like it or not, they are the historically and culturally connected cultural institutions. Okay, I need to work on my English. Okay, from the eyes of the world, evangelicals, including offshoot groups like the PCA, are just in a bubble and disconnected from the rest of the world. So Jordan Cooper understands Protestants have lost a seat at the table, and I think he understands that it's because we don't have the same institutions that we used to have. Also, Jordan Cooper's wondering what it would look like hypothetically if the mainlines were retaken. I think the best case study of what that would look like is the LCMS, which Jordan Cooper's denomination, the AALC, is somewhat in communion with. So this is a map of LCMS churches across the country. The LCMS is sort of like the Lutheran equivalent of the PCA for Presbyterians. PCA is a conservative Presbyterian denomination. LCMS is a conservative Lutheran denomination. The difference is that LCMS is historic enough to be a mainline church. It's not a mainline church technically because it's not in communion with the other mainlines, but it's just as historic as the other mainlines. They just didn't want to go into communion with liberal denominations, and I can't exactly blame them for that. So I really support the LCMS. LCMS has historic, beautiful churches all over the country, everywhere, and that's something PCA doesn't have. LCMS has very old institutions all over the country, like Concordia Seminary. PCA barely owns any seminaries. Like Westminster Seminary is not even owned by PCA or any Reformed denomination. It's just loosely affiliated with them. LCMS is like mainline churches in that it actually owns a lot of historic seminaries and a lot of other institutions. It also has a lot of famous members. Dr. Seuss actually was a member of the LCMS. And when you have a mainline denomination like the LCMS, you'll find beautiful churches in like the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. Like Norfolk, Nebraska. Who lives there? Nobody lives there. maybe some cows or something. But there's still a beautiful Lutheran church in the middle of nowhere. Like, if you're PCA, you don't have that. You barely have any beautiful churches at all, except maybe in a few major cities or a few church plants that happen to buy back some old building. And of course, Reconquista is not about the buildings. People make fun of me like, oh, Redeem Zoomer just likes the buildings. No, no, no. What it's about is the institutions. And buildings are a sign of institutional power. Does your institution have enough power to build pretty buildings in every town across America? That's the sign of a strong institution. Ever since ancient Egypt, people would build things to show their institutional clout. The LCMS is a case study of what a reconquered mainline would look like, because the LCMS was seeing the same liberal drift as some of the mainlines, but in the mid-20th century there was that whole Seminex controversy where conservatives retook Concordia Seminary, and it was actually the progressives that fled and ended up joining the ELCA. So that's why the LCMS is just as historic as the ELCA, if not maybe a little bit more. So let's keep watching.
But I just don't see that same influence there. So I'm not convinced that having...
I just want to add, I forgot. The LCMS as a denomination has way more influence than conservative offshoots do. There's a big difference in the attitude of LCMS Lutherans and PCA Presbyterians. Almost everyone I've met in the LCMS is very conscious that they are an LCMS Lutheran specifically. They belong to that particular institution. Whereas the vast majority of PCA Presbyterians I've met, some of them are not even committed to being Presbyterian at all. They're just like, I just want a church that teaches the Bible, and this church happens to have good sermons. Like, half the members of the PCA would just as easily go to a Baptist church, but they just like the preaching and kids program at that particular PCA church. And even if they're committed to being Presbyterian in a vague sense, they would just as easily attend an EPC or OPC church if that was in their area. So if you have a denomination that is founded as an offshoot, that is founded upon not caring about the institutions, you're never going to get people in those denominations who care about the institutions, because that goes against the very foundation of that denomination.
Having an old building or being a part of one of these more established older mainline churches is actually going to lead to significant influence in the world. And some of that, I think, can be demonstrated by means of a various amount of studies that have been done, like if you look at Barna.
Also, to counter that, look at the Southern Baptist Church. The Southern United States is the only part of the United States that still has a conservative, historic Protestant church. Like, the Southern Baptist Church is the mainline church in much of the South. And I think that is why the South has stayed culturally conservative. Even though I'm a Yankee, I hate to give credit to the South, but I have to give credit to the South. They have a conservative institutional Protestant church, and that has had a massive influence on Southern culture.
Research and studies, my wife has written a number of them. When they look at patterns of, say, personal prayer life, Bible reading, how important is your faith to you, consistently, the mainline churches do not have the same kind of prioritization of their faith as the evangelical churches do, which means that...
And I fully agree. He's just talking about the fact that the mainlines are liberalized, which, I mean, yeah, I know. That's why I'm here. That's why we're doing a Reconquista project in the first place. But that has nothing to do with how much institutional power they have.
What those churches teach is not going to actually be as influential upon the congregants probably as the evangelical churches, because the people in those churches don't tend to prioritize their faith as much as those who are part of evangelical churches. And then another element of this idea of the influence of the mainline churches is that America is not in the same situation as those who have a state church. So I was just in Finland recently, for example, and they have a state church, and that state church is a Lutheran church, though largely the church is apostate, but not all of the church is apostate, and there are Christians there that are really wrestling with what their connection to that church should be. So these questions are certainly relevant in that context. Or you have the Anglican Church, of course, in England. The Church of England still has some impact, at least. I don't know how much culturally, but it historically certainly has. America has never had this either singular body or even really groups of churches that have the same level of influence. I think
I would say that even though America doesn't have an official state church, if you look deep into the history of the mainline churches, which I do, American Protestantism is my favorite type of church history to study. They have almost as much influence as European state churches, if not more, because America has just always had a more religious atmosphere than Europe, generally speaking. So I would say, like, the Episcopal Church, man, the Presbyterian Church USA, the United Methodist Church, that's had insane influence on America's culture. I'd say even more than some of the European state churches.
See this kind of shifting or changing influence between churches when you look at early American church-going practices. By the 1800s, it was the case that most influential people in America, or the most influential people, tended to go to Unitarian churches. They were Unitarians, they were heretics. Whereas at other times, the Episcopal churches were the places of the most significant influence. Obviously, you have the congregation.
Yeah, and the Unitarian Church was mainline during its time. It was not mainline Protestant, it was mainline heretical. It was not even Christian, but it was just as institutional and influential as the other mainlines like the Episcopal Church.
Initially in the colonies. And by the 20th century, the Unitarians had basically died out. I mean, you have the Unitarian Universalist churches that exist today, but they're not even that connected to what the Unitarian churches were before, and they have no cultural influence whatsoever. The point is, even in American religious history, if you look at the influence of various church groups, that influence changes and it sways back and forth. There's no stability. There isn't a stable church that has influence in the same way that there is in other countries.
I'm aware that there's not one particular institution that's given some promise to always be the church, but the common theme in all these churches that have ever been influential is resources. And you cannot create resources ex nihilo. The ACNA cannot accumulate massive amounts of resources just by being in communion with random bishops in Timbuktu. Resources are developed over many, many generations. So it is theoretically possible that some other form of Protestantism could replace the mainlines. They would need a massive amount of resources, and the only Protestant resources that exist today in America are in the mainline churches. Splitting off from them is leaving all the resources behind, so that is not going to work.
And it is the case, if you look at, say, the American political landscape in the 20th century, especially the latter part of the 20th century, it was the Jerry Falwell Baptist anti-institutional types that had a really significant political influence. Look at who has cultural and political influence in the administration today. It tends to be the most extreme, wacky, charismatic types that have influence, that are anti-institutional. So American culture in its relation to religion has never been something stable. And I don't know that retaking the mainline churches is going to create stability. I'm just not convinced that there's any evidence of that in history or in the direction that the culture is actually currently going. And that's the other point, another point that I want to make here, is the way that culture is currently moving is one of institutional instability as a whole. I don't think we really know what the impact of our move to the internet has been or is going to be in the future. We don't really know what this is going to look like. It's been long enough that we obviously see trends. In the past, I would say it was absolutely the case that institutions provided the most stability and the best kind of stability in a multi-generational sense. And I think they should. I think that's a good thing. But the more that we have moved toward a notion of celebrity to influencer, we have begun to prioritize in a more significant way individual personalities over institutions themselves. So as strange as this might be, I would say that, if you're looking at something like an Ivy League college, when I talk to those students at Ivy League universities, and I talk to them about what they're doing with their time, who's impacting their life and who's impacting what they're thinking, they largely point to people on the internet. Yes, they're going to be formed by their studies. Yes, they're going to be formed by the institution that they come out of and the institutional network and connections that creates. And yes, they're going to be connected to institutions in their jobs. But they're also formed in a significant way by the people that they are listening to on the internet. Take somebody like Radim Zoomer. The irony of it is this: Radim Zoomer, as a guy who makes videos on the internet, has more influence, I believe, on Ivy League students who are Christians than any of the mainline churches do, maybe combined.
So I appreciate that. I don't think it's a good thing. It's probably true. But as I said in the beginning, there's a difference between influence on people's minds and influence on resources, because I have a large social media platform, so I can get my thoughts out to a lot of people at once. But I don't have resources. And in the Reconquista project that I've been involved with, I started a nonprofit called Presbyterians for the Kingdom, by the way, which you can donate to on the donor box. Link is in the description. The reason we need donations is because we don't really have that many resources, and we've had to make partnerships with wealthy PCUSA mainline churches because we need the resources. And I'll take this opportunity to share a lot of the amazing success we've had in our denomination. Presbyterians for the Kingdom, our nonprofit, is gaining a reputation in the PCUSA for reviving historic mainline churches. We're getting lots of people to go to churches in Cincinnati like Covenant First Presbyterian Church, which is a beautiful, conservative mainline church. And our reputation is spreading across the denomination. As a result, there are very wealthy pastors and wealthy churches that are starting to sponsor all of us in the Reconquista to go to seminary for free. You don't have that kind of resource in evangelical denominations. Basically, every PCA or evangelical seminarian I know is going into like crippling debt. Everything for us Reconquistadors is covered because mainline churches are stacked, bro. They're stacked.
That's my experience. Maybe that's not the case as a whole. But I think that's the direction we're moving in. Now, I think the best thing we can do, if people...
You don't need to be a sociologist to know that money means influence. The mainline churches might be attended by 7 boomers on average, but they have way more money than all other Protestant groups combined. Now, I hate to be so New Yorkish and of my tribe in this analysis, but, you're going to need resources and money to influence the culture. And buying back the buildings is not going to give you the resources because you have to spend your own resources to buy back the buildings. That's why just buy back the buildings, bro, is not an alternative to the Reconquista movement.
Who have, like myself too, a platform is to point people to local churches and institutions. So that they're not just relying on like somebody they watch on.
And that's what I do as well. I always point people to local churches and institutions using my 2 church maps. I have 2 maps. This one is a map of conservative mainline churches. This is a map of just historic Protestant churches all over the world in general, regardless of whether they're mainline. So I do include some schismatic churches on this map as well, because even though I don't agree with their schism, I want to give people the option.
Online, right? And that's what we want. But my point in saying that is to say that the way that influence works in the cultural sphere has really shifted and is going to continue to shift and change. And so if we're talking about institutional influence in the past, we do largely think about buildings because people live in physical spaces and people actually live in the center of town. And the center of town or the center of cities is not just a dangerous place where nobody wants to be. They'll move out to the suburbs and drive everywhere. And in that context, yeah, having the church in the center of the city matters a lot, and it's going to have a lot of influence because people are actually walking around and people actually want to live there and want to spend time there. But as people move out of those places, and those places are no longer places of influence, I'm not convinced that the building actually matters at this point in the same way that it would have in a different cultural context.
I'm not sure about that. I think that this digitization of everything is eventually going to wear off because of how unnatural it is. Same way I think we're starting to see some of the LGBT stuff wearing off because it just goes against the way reality is structured. So I know that there's this temporary moment where people are trying to digitize everything and make everything virtual. But I think Gen Z is having a strong reaction against living their lives online because they're realizing just how important in-person interactions with things are. I agree with Dr. Cooper that there is a trend towards decentralization with the internet, but that's bad. I feel like influencers like myself have only been able to rise because of institutional failure, but I'm trying to fix the institutions so that I don't need to exist anymore.
Just sociologically moved to such a different way of life that the things that worked in the past are probably not going to work in the same way in the future. Yeah, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I don't think it is a good thing. But it's just the reality that we live in right now. And I think we have to really reckon with all of that as we're thinking about these kind of things, these major questions of influence in the future and exactly what that looks like. So we're also seeing this move away even from the most influential or important kind of brick and mortar type of institutions. So many seminaries are closing right now because everybody's doing things on the internet. Education is becoming completely unaffordable for most people, so people are pursuing alternate routes.
Education is affordable if you're in a mainline church that is funding your seminary education.
So what does that mean for the institutions that shape and form culture in the future? I don't know, but the landscape is going to be pretty different, whatever that's going to look like. And then I want to just point out a couple other things. The Reconquista idea, or the goal of Reconquista, sounds very much like something that somebody who was young would be drawn to.
Yup.
And this is just the reality of life, that when people are young, they're very optimistic about the world, and they want to change the world. And the older you get, the more, pessimistic, the more realism kind of seeps into your experience, and you change the way you think about things.
So I wouldn't say the Reconquista movement is based on optimism. Like, the reason I keep going back to Reconquista despite reconsidering it, all the time, is because of a pessimism about all the alternatives. I feel like those who don't want to join the Reconquista have an optimism about the chances that offshoots like the ACNA and the PCA have to rebuild Protestantism in America. My drive for Reconquista is not necessarily an optimism about the main lines, but a pessimism about everything else.
So I think there's a reason why the people that are really engaged in the Reconquista project are all very young, for the most part. Maybe not everybody, because there obviously are pastors that are involved.
I wouldn't say that's why they're engaged, because every, boomer in the PCUSA that I talk to about the Reconquista gets really excited and opens up their pocketbook to help us. The reason it's mostly young people involved in the Reconquista is because it was started by me, a Gen Z internet YouTuber, a Gen Z YouTuber whose audience is mostly young people. So I don't think it's only young people involved because it's an idealistic crusade. And it's also we have quite a few older folks that are involved and have become official members and are even getting their churches to vote to become official PFTK churches.
Involved and want to change the churches, and that's a good thing. But there is a kind of optimism that you have at a certain point in life that tends to dissipate. And I don't want to say this is I feel like this sounds condescending, of like, you young people don't know what you're doing. And I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying that this is a reality that happens all the time.
And it is true. I am young. Dr. Cooper's a lot older than me. According to scripture, I have to take his advice. So let's see what he's going to say.
And it really does change when you have children. So if you weren't...
Yes, the what about my kids thing. So I don't have kids. I know I don't. I'm only 22. I know I'm not in a place to really talk about this. But that is only a question if you're considering going to a liberal mainline church. Everyone forgets that the vast, vast majority of cases are ones where we're telling people to go to conservative mainline churches like these. Now, of course, someone's going to say, oh, it's not conservative enough because this and this. Yeah. But these are churches where they all believe the gospel and there's no LGBT stuff. They're not going to trans the kids or whatever people say. So in the vast majority of cases, if you live anywhere in America, unless you live in some island off the coast of Alaska, there is a conservative mainline church near you. If the only mainline option is a radically liberal one, and you don't think your kids will do well in that environment, then that's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I don't really see a reason, even if you do have a lot of kids that you got to raise in the faith, why you should be averse to just seeking out a conservative mainline congregation.
You're in a position where you are in a church where you're fighting for the truth, and you're fighting for orthodoxy. It's one thing to involve yourself in that kind of fight, and maybe it's not that hard to get yourself involved in that kind of battle. It's a very different thing when you have kids. It's a very different thing, and if you don't have kids, you don't get it. I'm sorry, but you don't. When you have kids, your concerns change, and the way that you look...
Yeah, now, generally, I still would say if you have kids, try to go to a conservative mainline church, but also, I would much rather see my kids... I'd much rather my kids see me fighting for something I believe than running away and sheltering them. Because I see this all the time. Fundamentalist parents will shelter their kids from any liberalism, and the kids go liberal the second they get any exposure. I think the best thing to do is to expose your children to a variety of perspectives early on. Children listen to their fathers more than pastors or anyone else. Even though I'm not saying you should send your kids to liberal churches, but I'm also saying that if you do, you should have faith in God. Because in conservative evangelical mindsets, there's this implicit idea that liberals have a stronger influence than fathers or the Holy Spirit. If you've baptized your children and you're a father and you're catechizing your children well, you should have faith that your influence combined with the Holy Spirit in their baptism is going to be stronger than the influence of whatever liberalism they might encounter in church. In every retreatist, there's this implicit idea that liberalism is stronger than God, and that the victory of liberalism is inevitable, and you just have to run away.
Look at the world changes. I did this. Every parent does this. And so my primary concern then becomes, how do I make sure that this is a spiritual environment where my kids are going to actually flourish and be protected from lies, and that they can actually function in the world as human beings who are faithful to the God who created them. My parents had to make a decision when I was young to leave a church that we had attended in my younger years. The pastor there started teaching that the events of Jesus' life as recorded in the Gospels were mythic. They weren't real historical narratives, that there was some kind of underlying spiritual truth underneath the records of miracles.
Now, when I first became a Christian, I was like a liberal Christian. I was fully LGBT affirming. I didn't believe the Bible was infallible. And I had one of these pastors for 2 years. There was this lady who became the pastor of my church in high school. She started saying that the resurrection didn't happen and that we're supposed to disagree with the Bible. And it was due to her bad preaching that I actually realized what the truth is. And it was seeing how bad her preaching was that actually made me go from a liberal Christian to a more theologically conservative Christian. So I don't think it's always the case that exposure to liberalism is going to make you liberal. If you have the resources to combat it, you will be able to resist it. And I think if your faith can really move mountains, like Jesus said, we should have a bit more faith that we can move a mainline church in the right direction.
Miracles, and that they weren't real events. And people in that church fought this, and people had two different responses. Some of them stayed until the pastor left, and they got a pastor who's more orthodox and good for the church.
Good. That happened at my church, too.
I think, from what I hear, they're in a better place, certainly, than they were then. But then a number of other people left. And why did they leave? Well, they left because they had kids. And if you have children, the question is, do you want to bring your children to a place where they are being fed heresy from a pulpit on a regular basis? Like, even if you want to fight that battle, is that the best thing to do for the spiritual life of your children? And I think the answer is pretty obviously no.
I would say it's up to your decision. I'm not pressuring anyone to do this, but I am saying it's still an option. Because kids will listen to their fathers more than a sermon. Kids generally don't pay attention to sermons. They do pay attention to fathers. And I strongly believe that if a father is dedicated to catechizing his children, because fathers are the spiritual head of the household, the children will listen. And the vast majority of the time when I see kids abandon the faith, it's not because they went to a church that had a little bit of liberalism. It's because their fathers did not put in the effort to catechize their kids. Often it's the young Sheldon syndrome, where it's the mother that's really involved and the father's just sort of going along with it. Or the father outsources the catechizing of the kids to a Sunday school teacher. No, if the father catechizes his children well, there is a very high probability they will stay faithful.
So there are a lot of considerations, I think, that maybe when you're younger you just don't think in the same way. But after you have kids, things change. The way you look at the world changes, and that's a reality. And then the other is talking about what does it mean to schism and to have schism. And a lot of times the American context is very complicated. So I think the way that the Reconquista tends to portray break-off groups is essentially that there is simply, a church that happens to move toward liberalism, and all the conservatives just choose to schism or choose to leave on their own and start something new. But a lot of times, the history of church bodies is way more complicated than that. So, for example, if you look at my own church body, which is the AALC, maybe it's viewed as a schism in some way, but it's really...
Well, I don't view it as a schism. The AALC and the LCMS, which are in communion with each other, are like remnant denominations, meaning they didn't schism from the main line, they just refused to join a mainline merger.
Not. So if you look at the history of the AALC, we go back to a number of different separate Lutheran groups. So if you look at the history of American Lutheranism, it's very complicated because American Lutherans don't immigrate as a whole. It's not like there are a bunch of Lutherans that just all come over to the United States together, at least initially. That does happen with Saxon immigration in the mid-19th century. But there are these isolated pockets of some Lutherans that show up in different places. And those Lutherans have no clear connection really between one another or the country that they just left, or that tie kind of gets broken after a while. So you have a lot of individual congregations in different places that have to organize. So it's a little different from having one church that splits. You're talking about a bunch of individual congregations that have to figure out how do we find other people and other congregations to join together as a church instead of just operating as this little independent congregation of immigrants, often without a pastor. Maybe I'll do something on the history of early American Lutheranism, which I've wanted to do for a while. But then as those groups come together, you have a group that's called the ALC, the American Lutheran Church, and that's formed in the early 20th century, which is a merger of other groups. Then you have another merger that then creates another group that's also called the ALC. Sometimes it's called TALC instead of ALC, and that's like 1960, I think, that happens. And then there is a proposal for a merger that is the merger that becomes the ELCA in the 1980s. So the ELCA is not some kind of historic church body. The ELCA is a new church. The ELCA is a new church that was created by old churches that's...
So I wouldn't say mergers count as new churches. If you're starting an institution from scratch, that's a new church. That'd be like the PCA or the ACNA, or at least the ACNA in all the regions except the ones where they took dioceses with them, like South Carolina and Fort Worth. But mergers, like the PCUSA is a merger, but it's a merger of two pre-existing historic mainline denominations in the North and the South, which used to be one before the Civil War. So I will grant to the LCMS that they are just as historic as the ELCA, but it's not true that the ELCA is entirely schismatic. One of the pieces that formed the ELCA was schismatic from the LCMS, but the others were not. The ELCA is a merger, and mergers often do inherit the institutions. They usually do. So I would say in the case, it's the same deal in like the Australia where the Uniting Church was a merger of the liberal ends of the other denominations. In cases like that, I would say neither side is schismatic.
Got rid of their own constitutions and structures and created a new one. So what is the AALC as a church body? We are a group of congregations that didn't want to merge, right? So we're a group of congregations that said we don't want to join this new church body. We actually want to retain the constitution of the ALC. We want to retain our identity in our churches rather than joining and merging to form this new church. So the question is, well, is that schism?
No, it's not, because you straight up did not leave, and you kept the brand name, you kept your properties, you kept all the institutions you could. I know some institutions went ELCA, but it was not a voluntary departure from the pre-existing institution.
Is that a schism? Well, in what sense are you saying it's a schism? I mean, we are a church that didn't inherit the seminaries and buildings of the ALC, though a lot of our churches do have buildings.
Yeah, but I don't think it's about the buildings. So yeah, if hypothetically 99% of the PCUSA just joined the Unitarian Universalist Church and 1% stayed behind, if like only 80 churches stayed behind, that's like 1% of the PCUSA, yeah, it wouldn't be schism.
Buildings that were in the ALC, but not the big educational institutions. Well, is that a schism? So in some sense, we don't have the buildings, but in reality, it was our attempt to actually stay the same institution instead of...
Yeah, I agree. So I fully agree with Jordan Cooper on the first and last parts of his videos. I feel like he's contradicting some of his earlier statements in previous videos when he says, oh, institutions don't matter that much anymore, now it's like influencers. I'm sorry, Dr. Cooper, you've taught me well that Yale still has more influence than Redeemed Zoomer. So, in short, I I greatly respect Dr. Cooper. I recommend his videos to anyone who wants to learn about Protestantism and stuff. I think the main thesis, if I were to boil down my main point in this video, is that the mainline churches have lost some of their influence, but they are a sleeping giant.